Hi class, I'm going to be explaining cellular respiration in two videos. In the first video, I'm going to be discussing glycolysis and aerobic versus anaerobic respiration. And in the second video, I'll be discussing mitochondrial structure, the link reaction, the Krebs cycle, oxidative phosphorylation, and the electron transport chain. I know you're really looking forward to that second one. Okay, so what is cellular respiration? Cellular respiration is the process of taking the glucose in the food, burning it essentially, producing carbon dioxide, water, and putting it in the form of energy, ATP, that can be used for other cellular processes. So, as I said, glucose is in the bloodstream after food is digested. And you breathe in oxygen through a series of chemical reactions that we're going to discuss. You exhale carbon dioxide, release water, and you use that energy in the form of ATP. Okay, so let's look at the first assessment statement. It says, state that oxidation involves the loss of electrons from an element, whereas reduction involves a gain of electrons. Now, the easiest way to remember this, as the book had said, is oil rig. Oil rig stands for oxidation is losing electrons, and reduction is gaining electrons. Continue reading the statement, and that oxidation frequently involves gaining oxygen or losing hydrogen, whereas reduction frequently involves losing oxygen or gaining hydrogen. So it kind of makes sense from the word. You see loss of hydrogen atoms here. For the carbons are oxidizing, they're gaining oxygen atoms, so you can see the carbons are with oxygen. And the opposite happens for hydrogen. There's a loss of hydrogen atoms. In this case, if we understood the oxidation states, which you may have covered in chemistry class, but that's okay if you didn't, the electrons are moving away from the carbons in this process. For reduction, there is a gain of hydrogen atoms and a gain of electrons if you were to know how to count the oxidation states. Again, not important right now. These processes, when put together, they always have to go together. They're called redox. Reduction and oxidation together. When the electrons leave the glucose, they go into the water. Okay. So the first step of respiration is glycolysis. And it's a 10-step process with 10 different enzymes. But we're not going to talk about it in such detail because you don't need to know it at that level. Let's read the assessment statement. 372 states that in cell respiration, glucose in the cytoplasm is broken down by glucose into pyruvate with a small yield of ATP. So the key to knowing this is that this is happening in the cytoplasm of the cell. The glucose is in the bloodstream. It diffuses into the cytoplasm of the cell, and it undergoes glycolysis. So what do you need to know? Well, glucose, remember, is a 6-carbon molecule, and you add 2 ATPs. So in this case it says subtract because you have to use them. Remember, ATP becomes ADP. That energizes the molecule so that it breaks. Now this is called lysis. And then through several chemical reactions, you convert that to a molecule called pyruvate, which also has 3 carbons. And in the process, you make 4 ATP and 2 NADHs. Notice you gain 4 ATP, but you use 2 ATP. So there's a plus 2 ATP net increase. and you get 2 NADHs as well. Okay, so at this point, the best thing to do is to take a look at a video, actually the one we watched in class already. I'll run it with the sound off, but you can read the parts at the bottom and I will talk about it as we go. You have glucose here as a 6-carbon molecule. So as I said, first you're going to have an enzyme that adds the phosphates to it. You're adding 2 ATPs and it gets added to the glucose molecule. So you have a 6-carbon sugar with 2 phosphates, diphosphate. Now that you've energized the molecule to a higher energy state, it splits up. That's called lysis. Now you have 2 3-carbon molecules, each with 1 phosphate. Then, through a series of chemical reactions with NAD plus makes NADH and ADP makes ATP, those phosphates get added to ADP. And now you get pyruvate at the end. In fact, 2 pyruvate molecules. And notice you started with 6 carbons and you end up with 6 carbons. But in this case, it's 2 3-carbon molecules. So as a review of that video, we'll take a look at 8.1.2, which is outline the process of glycolysis, including phosphorylation, lysis, oxidation, and ATP formation. So in the first step of glycolysis, you had to add the phosphates to the 6-carbon glucose. That's what phosphorylation is. It means adding phosphates. When you add the phosphates, you energize the molecule so it can undergo lysis, which means splitting of the molecule. The next step is oxidation. Oxidation, as you remember from oil, oxidation is losing electrons, and that means that the NAD is going to gain the electrons. That reduces to become NADH. And then that energy that's produced goes to taking the phosphates and adding them to make ATP. In the end, you get 2 3-carbon molecules, 2 pyruvates from the 1 6-carbon molecule that you started with. Now, if you have oxygen, one thing happens. If you don't have oxygen, you have a process called anaerobic respiration. It means without oxygen. This assessment statement says, explain that during anaerobic cell respiration, pyruvate can be converted in the cytoplasm into lactate or lactic acid or ethanol and carbon dioxide with no further yield of ATP. So when you look at this figure, you see down here that when you don't have oxygen, yeast produced alcohol or alcohol and CO2, or other organisms which usually do aerobic respiration. When you don't have oxygen, produce lactic acid. So for example, in your muscles, when they get sore when you exercise excessively, when you produce lactic acid. In 3.7.4, you see it says, explain that during aerobic cell respiration, pyruvate can be broken down into carbon dioxide and water with a large yield of ATP. So that's this right side of the figure. It happens in mitochondria. You produce 34 more ATP when you have oxygen, and we'll discuss that further in the future video. So, what have we discussed? We've discussed only this part of the process, and that happens in the cytoplasm. Glucose through glycolysis making pyruvate and a yield of net 2 ATP. Okay, So that's the end of the first video, and I'll give you the rest of the process in the second one. Thanks.